Rider battles to stem a reign of lawless steel rails to peril. By Charles N. Heckelman. The masked rider battles to stem a reign of lawlessness and destruction. When enemies of progress use railroad rivalry as a cloak for their foul, murderous schemes. Chapter 1. The Wreck in Solo Canyon. The long Wyoming and Western construction train toiled up the grade towards Solo Canyon on gleaming, newly bolted rails, with black smoke belching from the locomotive stack. A crisp winter wind with a razor-sharp edge whipped the smoke in a feathery, trailing plume above the line of gondolas and flats that jolted through the bleak, rugged, northern Wyoming country. Up in the engine cab, ruddy-faced Tom, a complete book-length Wayne Morgan novel. Brady flicked a glance at the steam gauge, shoved the throttle forward through the entire arc of the sextant. The rhythm of the hammering piston strokes increased, and there was an eager rush of steam up through the stack. The train buckled, couplings crashing in a solid rattle, and the huge high-wheeler's drive rods spun over the rails in a gray-black blur. Mike O'Leary, the soot-smudged tallow pot, hooked open the firebox door with his scoop and bailed in more coal. Flames lipped and danced, flushing a bright ruby glow across the cab floor. "Keep feeding her, Mike, me boy," yelled Brady, turning his good-natured Irish face toward O'Leary's bent back. "Sure, and we need every pound of steam we can get with this load behind us." O'Leary grinned and went on shoveling great scoops of coal upon the fire. The pressure steadily mounted, and the booming whack of the exhaust thundered in their ears. Behind the snorting locomotive was a loaded material train. Flats and gondolas heaped with rails, spikes, ties, rough board lumber for construction shanties, hay and grain, and a wide assortment of tools including axes, mauls, grading scoops, shovels, and tamping bars. And on the last flat in front of the caboose were a score of rough and tough, slab-muscled Irish paddies, ready to join the thousands already laboring for Wyoming and Western, helping to hew an empire of steel out of the wilderness. All day and all night, loaded supply trains rolled up from distant Kansas City, chuffing past the boomtown of Silverbow onto end of track where the rails and creosoted ties were spilled out upon the right-of-way. And always on the opposite track, other engines pulled long strings of empties back to Missouri to the supply depots. The rails marched on steadily, and at each mile the wilderness was pushed back. 4 miles, 5 miles a day the sweating, swearing, hard-fighting, hard-working section hands pushed those twin ribbons of steel. Far ahead, engineers and surveyors were making final checks on their location lines. 50 miles from end of track, 1,000 graders labored with scoops and shovels, and straining horse and mule teams, plowing through hills and valleys, putting down a level roadbed for the rails. 3 miles of new track each day had been the highest construction mark reached by Wyoming and Western. Yet Division Superintendent Jim Brown at Silverbow and Colonel Jack Darwin, one of the big directors from the East, were not satisfied. They wanted 6, even 7 miles of track laid. They had to hit that mark or go down to certain defeat in the headlong race with Colorado Central to push steel into Salt Lake. The federal government had bestowed extensive land grants and subsidies upon both roads, yet only one railroad would be permitted to set up a terminal in Salt Lake. That meant the loser would be forced to detour and continue on westward to some other town, build a new town in the hope that it would attract sufficient freight and passenger traffic to keep the road operating. For months, the grim race had been going on. From early spring and on through a torrid summer, Wyoming and Western and Colorado Central had driven their construction crews without any let-up. Now, with winter approaching, in Wyoming and Western, heading into a stiff range of mountains, there was imminent danger of all construction being halted by the first big blizzard. Both Wyoming and Western and Colorado Central had to fight the natural hazards of the wilderness, the rugged and unbroken country, the broiling heat, sudden raids on section lines by warring Sioux and Arapaho, fights in the boomtowns, and the daily strike of death through violence or disease. But lately other trouble had beset Wyoming and Western, trouble that had nothing to do with Indian raids or disease or natural hazards. Tom Brady was thinking of these new and ominous developments when he shouted a question at O'Leary. "Do you think we'll be making the run to end of track safely this time, Mike?" O'Leary drew a grimy sleeve across his sweat-streaked forehead and grinned. But before he could answer, a third man in the engine cab, Jack Banyan, broke in. Banyan was Wyoming and Western's new troubleshooter on his way to replace Sid Stevens, who had been shot by saloon toughs. "Is there anything to cause you to think you won't reach end of track without accident?" Banyan asked tensely. "Are ye's forgetting the 3 supply trains that were wrecked within the last 5 weeks?" asked Brady. "I'd heard they were accidents, 2 caused by loosened rails and faulty roadbed." "That's what they're saying," grunted bunch of hard cases tagging along at his heels. "You're wrong, Tom," insisted O'Leary, leaning on his shovel, stumpy legs braced as the train swayed around a curve. "It's Big Ed Graham that the railroad's got to watch. The government took away a lot of his free graze and handed it to Wyoming and Western. Graham ain't a man to forget that. Sure, and I'll give yez 3-1. It's him that got them tie cutters to strike for their overdue pay." Wayne Morgan Brady in anger leaped into his blue eyes. "But don't believe it. There ain't a better rail gang foreman alive than Pat Callahan, who's riding this train. When he lays steel and his patties hammer the spikes home, the tracks are there to stay. And Lanny Borden's graders know their job too." "You think somebody's been tampering with the rails?" "That's what I do," growled Brady. "And I'm saying it's that bunch of Colorado Central scalawags who are trying to keep us from beating them to Salt Lake. If I know Bill Tracy, he'll stop at nothing. He's Central's troubleshooter, but he hangs around Wyoming and Western most of the time, and there's always a—" Brady shrugged. He turned to the cab window to slant a keen glance out along the rails that stretched steadily away up the slope. They were nearing the summit of the long grade now, and Solo Canyon had widened considerably. On either side stretched towering walls of shale, but on the right side the wall was close, while to the left was a level stretch broken by an occasional gully or culvert and rimmed by broken rocks and thorny brush. Brady tugged at the whistle cord. The thin, eerie wail sped through the canyon, bouncing back and forth from rock to rock. Into the tail end of that sound came a rumbling roar. It grew in volume, became a thunderous din, was multiplied by other booming concussions. Dread tinged Tom Brady's face gray as he lunged to the cab window. His narrowed eyes were greeted by the horrible picture of tons and tons of rock cascading into the defile. A gray smother of dust rose up to dim the sky's brightness. The landslide tumbled thousands of rocks down the shaly slopes. They swept over the tracks, buried them in debris and rubble. Brady swung back, shut off the throttle, and threw on the air brakes. Sparks flew from the pounding drivers. Brake blocks squealed against protesting wheel flanges, and the desperate engineer shoved open a petcock, shooting sand from the boiler dome to the rails, fighting the forward momentum of the train with air and sand. But the huge locomotive rolled on into the landslide. Hurtling boulders bounded down the mountainside, swept against the steel sides of the high-wheeler. Under that crushing, on-speeding weight, the locomotive left the rails. The cow-catcher and whirling drive wheels plowed into the other section of track, digging up the newly set ties, gouging a deep furrow in the roadbed. "Jump!" yelled Brady, but never knew whether the other two men made the jump in time. Suddenly, the locomotive plunged over on its side, careened down a shaly slope into an embankment. There was a deafening explosion as the boiler burst. A geyser of steam billowed into the sky. Metal crashed and splintered, and the loaded supply cars, with couplings and drawbars smashing, spilled sideward off the rails. Ties and spikes and rails were dumped to the roadbed and were engulfed by the landslide. Dust and smoke made a gray-black pall, and through the mounting racket came the terrible cries of smothered men as the lurching string of flats and gondolas were trapped in a gushing stream of rocks. Back in the flat car with his laborers, Pat Callahan, rail gang foreman, had been watching the swaying line of supply cars ahead of him and listening to the rhythmic click-clack of the wheels. Around him other paddies, brawny and bearded, and bearing the marks of hard and riotous living, lifted their brawling voices above the racket of the train, chafing at the inaction which held them on this flat car. Every head turned at the first booming roar of the landslide. Callahan, his broad, heavy-boned face mirroring instant concern, climbed to his feet and stared toward the front of the train. In one flashing instant, he saw the canyon wall ahead seem to come apart, then go crashing downward in a smothering spray of rock and dust and shale. The abrupt slash of the air brakes and the sand cutting into the train's momentum sent jolting, buckling crashes down the whole length of flats and gondolas. Callahan was thrown from his feet. Other paddies were nearly hurled off the flat. Men milled in a heaving tangle on the lurching car. Callahan scrambled up, saw the locomotive leave the tracks and go plunging across the right-of-way, tearing up ties and rails. Cinders and coal sprayed the air. Then fresh disaster came down upon the paddies as another rumbling roar above them announced the onslaught of more crashing rocks. The cliff face above dissolved amid a booming concussion into tons of sliding rock that rushed down upon the flat car and caboose. Chapter 2. The masked rider intervenes. Yelling to the other laborers, Callahan leaped into space. Other paddies followed suit. But those caught in the crush of bodies in the rear were not so fortunate. They were trapped in a hopeless tangle of arms and legs as the flat car upended and capsized. Callahan struck the edge of the roadbed on his shoulders. He felt a savage jolt of pain. A spinning rock glanced off his thigh. Another splinter slanted across his face, drawing a warm stream of blood. He rolled over and over, instinctively cowering against the cries of dying men, which knifed through the... There was a thunderous din, and tons of rock cascaded into the defile. Chapter 1. Horrible Din. For minutes he lay half-dazed among splintered ties, fallen rock and shale. Dust got into his throat and gagged him. But finally he stirred out of the debris and climbed uncertainly to his feet. He was big and solidly built, this Paddy. His hair was a shaggy black mane. There was a ruddiness to his complexion and wildness in his clear blue eyes. The mark of many a rough and tumble fight was on his cheeks and the white slash of a knife scar made a half-moon at the base of his wide jaw. Men were yelling and shouting on all sides. He saw then that the Paddies who had survived were moving through the debris, trying to free their comrades who lay buried beneath tons of rock. The roar of sliding rock had subsided now. Steam still hissed from the locomotive's split boiler, but the scene was ominously quiet as compared to the thunderous tumult which had filled the canyon minutes before.
"Work fast, Paddies," yelled Callahan. "We've got to be saving the other boys." "Another accident to delay Wyoming and Western," grunted one of the shaken section hands. "'Tis no accident in my mind," grumbled Callahan. "There's been too many of our supply trains wrecked lately. I'm betting it's the blasted Spalpeens from Colorado Central who—" He broke off as the sound of hoofs came from the shallow wall of the defile. "The Masked Rider," somebody yelled. Those who were not already busy moving ties and rails, lifting away huge boulders to free imprisoned victims, swung around to watch two riders slide their horses recklessly down the shaly slope of Solo Canyon. "Rifles, Paddies," a second hand shouted. "'Tis my belief the Masked Rider and the brown lad with him have something to do with this wreck." "Back, you fools," ordered Callahan, his eyes narrowing. "If 'tis the Masked Rider for sure, we'll not be needing our rifles. What I've heard about him makes me guess he's come to help, just as he's helped others all over the West." The two riders came on swiftly and drew to a halt at the edge of the right-of-way. The leader was, indeed, the Masked Rider, the Robin Hood outlaw whose exploits were known throughout the land. He was the follower of lonely, dangerous trails, the avowed enemy of all lawbreakers. No one knew anything of his past, nor where or when he had first appeared. But cowmen, traders, railroad pioneers, and freighters all through the West called him their friend, for his timely intervention had helped many stave off ruin or had put an end to the oppression of the lawless. As he dismounted, standing by the head of his gallant black stallion, Midnight, the Masked Rider was a stern, commanding figure. His shoulders, half concealed under a dark, flowing cloak, were broad and muscular. A black sombrero was tilted at a rakish angle over his thick, dark hair. His eyes, behind the narrow slits of a mask, were bright and sharply appraising. He was a man to whom trouble was no stranger. Fear had never played any role in his turbulent existence. All the wildness and tumult of frontier life were reflected in the recklessness of his spirit, in the savage directness with which he met each new peril. A pair of black-butted colts were thonged low on each thigh, and there was that in his eyes, in the smooth grace of each motion, which suggested he was a master in handling those six guns. His silent, mahogany-hued companion was Blue Hawk, a Yaqui Indian who accompanied the black-clad rider on every mission of mercy. Stolid and unmoving in the saddle, his dark eyes were incredibly watchful. He had been educated in a mission school and spoke English without an accent, but he retained the fierce courage and loyalty of the Yaquis, their keen ability at trailing. A white shirt and cotton drill trousers clothed his muscular body. A red bandeau held his shoulder-length black hair from his craggy features. Instead of a six-gun, he carried a keen-bladed sheath knife in the bright-colored sash about his waist. Callahan studied both riders briefly, then concentrated his attention upon the black-clad man. "I guess you're the Masked Rider, all right," Callahan said. "What ye's doing here?" "We were heading west," said the black-clad man, "when we saw the train enter the cut a few miles back. Then we heard the landslide and figured you fellers had run into trouble and might need help. The masked rider started toward the pile of rubble where a half-dozen paddies were toiling feverishly to free a man who lay half-buried under a pile of rocks. "No time for jawing here," he said crisply. "There's work to be done. Come on, Hawk." The Yaqui joined the masked rider, and they lent their strength and efforts to the task of pulling the paddy out of the rubble. The man was in agony, but he made no outcry, his lips set and firm. One look at the weight of rocks on his legs told the masked rider that both legs were broken. The masked man hurled several huge rocks aside. Then, with the help of Callahan and Blue Hawk, they rolled aside a particularly large boulder and pulled the prostrate Irishman clear. The victim was bleeding from several deep cuts. Working deftly and smoothly, the masked rider tore off strips of the man's shirt and dipped them in the flow of a small stream which seeped out of the canyon wall. He bathed the cuts quickly, then fashioned crude bandages. With an axe, he hacked some of the thin roofing shingles which had been tossed off one of the gondolas into crude splints and fastened them to the Irishman's fractured legs. Other maimed and wounded section hands were being pulled out of the wreckage. It was hot, fatiguing work, but Callahan's tough paddies were used to it. They dug and clawed at the rubble. Men, 2 and 4 to each rail, lifted them out of the welter of stones and ties and dirt. The masked rider paused, after moving a dozen rails and sections of a splintered flat car from the motionless body of a laborer who would never again swing a spike maul. His narrowed eyes wandered up and down the length of the wrecked train, seeing the twisted, overturned cars, the mountainous mass of rocks and dirt, the smashed remains of the once powerful locomotive. "Me and Hawk thought we heard an explosion," he said to Callahan. "A dynamite explosion, right in the midst of that uproar produced by the landslide." Callahan jerked his head up, instant attention in his widened blue eyes. "'Tis no surprise to me if ye did hear it," he said savagely. "We've been bucking Colorado Central all summer and fall in a race to Salt Lake. Them spalpeens would stop at nothing to halt our construction. It's them or the cattlemen. If you're so sure this wreck was not accidental, maybe we can find proof," suggested the masked rider. He straightened. "Hawk," he said, "take a ride back through the defile and get around to the south rim. See what you find up there." "Si, senor," replied the Indian stolidly. Callahan watched him ride off along the right-of-way, then turned back to the dead and wounded. Bitterness marked the Irishman's ruddy countenance and hot anger, too. "7 of the boys are still missing," he murmured thickly. The masked rider peered at the tangled confusion of split ties, uprooted rails, and scattered tools. His eyes were bleak and cold, and an aroused purpose began to simmer in his brain. "No help for them if they're buried under that mess," he said. "They're smothered by this time." He paused, and his voice grew deeper. "But we can find the skunks who did this and pay 'em back." A wild roar of approval greeted that. These paddies were a hard, brawling lot, not given much to a display of emotion, but seeing the ruthless destruction of their mates filled their eyes with tears that came unashamed. These men were spoiling for a fight. It showed in the thrust of their jaws, in the wild light bannering from their eyes. "Sure, and when we see Tracy and his Colorado Central bunch, we'll wipe up the town of Silver Bow with 'em," roared Callahan. The paddies began to clamber over the loose rock and shale toward the front of the train. They passed the capsized tender. detoured around the huge mound of coal which had spilled from the pocket and came to the wrecked locomotive. The force of its plunge from the rails had sent it burrowing 3 feet in the fresh earth. Strips of twisted metal lay strewn about. 50 feet from the cab lay the bodies of Tom Brady and Mike O'Leary. Both were dead, horribly maimed and scalded. Beside the masked rider, Callahan began to curse brokenly. The best hogger and fireman that ever batted the stack off an iron horse, he said at last, in a voice that was very quiet. He looked up then, peering about uncertainly. Wonder where that new troubleshooter is. Troubleshooter? Repeated the masked man. Yeah, heard he was supposed to catch this construction train for Silverbow and ride up in the engine cab. Don't know if he caught it or not. Didn't know his name, and don't see him here in the wreckage. Nothing more you can do here, the masked rider pointed out. Better string out those 3 handcars I saw on that gondola that didn't leave the tracks. Load the wounded on it and head for Silverbow. You can notify the railroad to send out a wrecking crew. Callahan swung around, his lusty voice booming into the late afternoon stillness. Get them handcars on the rails, me buckos. We're headin' for Silverbow. In a big phalanx, the Irishmen moved off. Quickly, a half-dozen of them hauled one of the handcars from the gondola and trundled it up canyon past the torn track and placed it on the rails. Soon all 3 handcars were waiting for the bodies of the injured to be carried up. The masked rider had wandered off down a slight embankment into a deep culvert, momentarily out of sight of the laboring construction crew. Stumbling along in the stunted brush and rubble, he came upon the sprawled body of a man. One side of the man's head was caved in, and his face was covered with bloody cuts and contusions. His eyes were glazed with approaching death, yet a feeble spark of life sent a whispering breath past his cracked lips. "Yup, you're the masked rider," he gasped. "Good, man. See Jim Brown, Silverbow, wreck in Solo Canyon. Can't take that job." The masked rider had dropped to his knees beside the man to catch the last of his whispered words. The man's hand moved to the breast pocket of his torn shirt. Then a shudder convulsed the long body, and death terminated his agony. Chapter 3. Boomtown. An impulse to violence shook the masked rider. Another man dead in this horrible wreck. Some premonition told him that here in the wilds of Wyoming, he was going to find an immediate use for his special talents with fist and 6-gun. He dug an exploring hand into the man's pocket and found a folded letter. It was from Colonel Darwin of Wyoming and Western to Division Superintendent Jim Brown. It read, "Brown, this letter will introduce Jack Banyan, your new troubleshooter. He's a tough customer and fast with his guns. Give him a free hand in Silverbow and at end of track. Colorado Central is building fast, and we've got to better our mark of 5 miles of track a day. Your job is to lay steel. Banyan's job will be to bust up any troubles or delays, no matter who he has to kill to do it. Those accidents to our construction trains must stop. And so must the riots in the saloons, if Banyan has to put the paddies to work tearing down every honky-tonk in Silverbow. Colonel Darwin." By the time the masked rider reached the end of the letter, his eyes were glittering with a strange brilliance. Here was trouble for the asking, a call he could not ignore. Somebody was trying to break Wyoming and Western. The masked man could guess from the tone of the letter that troubleshooters didn't last long, and he could guess that one would be a target for every saloon tough and all the border riffraff that swarmed into these prairie boom towns. But he suddenly resolved, and the decision made the blood hum in his veins, that from this moment, if he could get away with the masquerade, he would be the new Wyoming and Western troubleshooter. Quickly, he took out a pencil, carefully erased Banion's name from the letter, and substituted Wayne Morgan. Fortunately, the handwriting was a rough scrawl and not difficult to imitate. He rolled Banion's body deeper into the culvert and covered it with rocks and loose shale. Then he took a roundabout route back to the right-of-way. He arrived there just as Blue Hawk galloped into view. The Yaqui rode past the wreckage and pulled his horse to a halt close to the 3 handcars. "What did you find, Hawk?" the black-clad man asked eagerly. The Indian's expression remained taciturn, but his voice was vibrant with emotion. "The landslide was no accident, senor," he replied. He held up several strands of fuse, a stick of dynamite, and 2 percussion caps which had failed to detonate. "I found these up on the rim, as well as the prints of many horses." "That settles it," roared Callahan. "Sure, and I knew it was planned to wreck this train." "Somebody certainly wants to smash Wyoming and Western," the masked rider observed. "Which way did the tracks go, Hawk?" "West. I followed them for a half-mile, then lost them on hard ground." "Senor wishes me to pick up that trail again?" "No matter," said the masked rider. He called to Callahan. "How far is the nearest town from here?" 7 miles. The town is Silverbow." "I reckon that's where them riders went after the explosion," said the masked rider. "And no telling who they are once they lose theirselves in the crowds of a railroad boomtown." "Me and the boys will have our look, just the same," announced Callahan. "Shake a leg, buccos. We've got to get out of here." The Paddies moved off, intent on moving every victim of the wreck up to the handcars. The masked rider drew Blue Hawk aside. As briefly as possible, he told the Yaqui about Banion. Twin scarlet splashes leapt from the masked rider's gun bores, Chapter 10, and his plan to masquerade as the troubleshooter. "There's work for the masked rider here, Hawk," he whispered. "I aim to find out who's responsible for this wreck and others that have happened to construction trains. I like these fighting Irishmen, and they deserve a chance to know who they're bucking so's they can battle in the open. We'll ride off now. When we get out of sight, I'll circle back through the brush and make my appearance as the missing troubleshooter. You ride on to our camp beyond the northern rim of the canyon. I'll try to meet you there later tonight or tomorrow." The Indian nodded, his dark eyes brightening with the anticipation of action which usually followed the masked rider's decision to plunge into some new campaign against organized lawlessness. "If Senor needs help, he won't forget Hawk." "You know I won't." The masked rider stopped Callahan and announced his intention of leaving. "Sorry you've got to go," said Callahan. "Sure and ye were a help this day. If you're ever needing a friend, call on Pat Callahan. Yes'll be after finding me in one of Silverbow's saloons." The masked rider grinned. The gesture softened the granite cast to that part of his face which was visible below the mask. Blue Hawk came up with midnight, and the masked rider mounted. He and the Yaqui lifted their arms in farewell and galloped off. A sharp bend in Solo Canyon soon carried them out of sight of the laborers. Shortly, the masked rider pulled up and hastily discarded his black cloak, mask, and sombrero. Underneath the cloak, he wore a flannel shirt and plain black pants stuffed in dusty half boots. From his blanket roll, he took a battered gray hat and rolled up his masked rider clothing in the blanket behind Midnight's saddle. He was now Wayne Morgan. In this guise, he had often appeared as a wandering cowpuncher when necessity required the execution of certain acts which could not be accomplished in the identity of the masked rider. His eyes were a steady, penetrating blue, matching the solid strength and purpose of the rest of his features. Blue Hawk rode away, leading Midnight. Morgan swung about and ran back down the canyon, keeping to the thick brush which covered a good portion of the uneven gorge floor. He came up to the wreck just as Callahan and the few workers he had designated to man the handcars were prepared to set off for Silver Bow. Pausing only to smear his features with dirt, batter in the peak of his sombrero, and rip one trouser leg, Morgan broke through the brush beyond the smashed locomotive and staggered into view. His head came up as he appeared to see the other men for the first time. He uttered a hoarse cry. Callahan came running to his side. "Where did you come from, bucko?" he asked. Wayne Morgan weaved forward uncertainly. He kept his voice hoarse and strained. "I'm Wayne Morgan, new troubleshooter," he mumbled. "Sure, and we looked all over for yous," said the blunt-jawed Callahan. "Heard there was supposed to be an extra man riding with the engineer. Hurt bad?" "Reckon not. Just knocked out. I jumped as the locomotive left the rails, rolled down into a culvert, and smashed my head against a rock. You headin' for Silver Bow?" "Yeah. It's welcome yez are to join us," he bawled at the other men. "Make room for one more and start pumping it, let's." Wayne Morgan squeezed into a place on the lead handcar which carried 4 battered, moaning laborers besides Callahan and another man. Callahan bellowed the order to start, and the 3 handcars clattered along the rails toward the summit of the grade. Darkness had laid its hand upon the land when the 3 handcars, loaded with weary and exhausted men, rattled up to the depot in Silver Bow. The thick sky was overcast, and winter's wind drilled down from the higher peaks. A switch engine, its bell clanging noisily, headlights spearing a path through the gloom, back past and spotted a string of empties on a siding. 2 long material trains were on the main line, waiting to be shunted to end of track. Surplus ties and rails were piled in rows along the tracks. Somewhere farther along, another locomotive with a noisy exhaust set the rails to trembling as it rumbled forward. Morgan helped carry the injured laborers across the yard and into the seething, bawling confusion that was the boomtown of Silver Bow. He had a fleeting glimpse of a wide, rutted street lined by tent shops and saloons, and an occasional flimsy board structure. Lights flushed yellowly out into the street from the honky-tonks, and the streets were already alive with paddies in from end of track. The flat, tinny crash of a band sent its thunder into the night, yet it was engulfed by the humming roar of voices, the intermittent yelling of barkers, trying to attract trade to the various saloons. The injured laborers were deposited in a wide tent, which Morgan learned belonged to a frontier doctor who was following the line of steel. He was finding steady business repairing broken heads after street brawls or digging bullets from the bodies of victims of shooting scrapes. When Callahan and the others left him, Morgan saw them make a rush for the 2-story frame structure which housed the railroad offices. On the way, they yelled the news of the wreck to their friends among the crowd. It spread like wildfire. It was on every tongue. Ominous threats filled the night, and a mob stormed toward the depot even before a giant of a man appeared in front of the railroad shack and sent out a call for volunteers to man a wrecking train. In short order, a special train was hooked up, and 500 eager section hands jumped on the flat cars. The engineer jerked at the whistle cord, then the special snorted out of the depot and went jolting across switch frogs to disappear into the night. Ramming his way through the seething throng Wayne Morgan got to the railroad office and climbed the outside stairs to the second story. At the door marked, "Division Superintendent," he rapped. A gruff voice bade him enter. Morgan shoved open the door. He found himself facing a bear of a man with a cigar clamped firmly between his strong teeth. He had been stalking up and down the room, his hands clasped behind his back. When he whirled, Morgan saw how big those hands were. They were the hands of a spiker, blunt and heavy and hard as granite. Sharp gray eyes under heavy dark brows studied Morgan boldly, making their swift, sharp judgment of him. "Are you Jim Brown?" Morgan asked. "Yeah." The reply was curt, neither friendly nor unfriendly. "Then you're the man I want to see. I'm Wayne Morgan, your new troubleshooter. I've got a letter from Colonel Darwin." Brown snatched the extended letter from Morgan's hand. He merely glanced at it, then crumpled it into a ball. He was wearing a single long-barreled gun on his right hip, and now his eyes lingered upon the two weapons Morgan carried. "It's a tough job," he growled. "So I've heard," said Morgan, and showed Brown the edge of a reckless grin. Brown was unimpressed. A frown creased his broad forehead. He was a bundle of energy, a man who got things done by the drive of his will and the steady thrust of his personality. There was little patience or tolerance about him. "I see you carry 2 guns, Brown grunted. His wide mouth stretched out to show the line of his teeth, yet that could not have been defined as a smile. There was something wary about this man who looked as if he seldom smiled. Chapter 4. Troubleshooter Round was narrowly watching Morgan, and though his words were not a question, Morgan knew a question was implied. "I can see what you're thinking," he said to the Wyoming and Western Division Superintendent. "The answer is that I wouldn't carry 2 guns if I couldn't use them." Jim Brown lunged swiftly to one side, his hand digging for his gun. It came up in a blinding blur of speed, yet it never even reached the level of his belt, for he found himself staring into the twin black bores of Morgan's Colts. "Testing me out?" Morgan inquired casually. His manner was indolent but subtly dangerous. A grin that proved Brown could smile spread across his features. He holstered his gun. "Not many men can shade me," he said. "Looks like you'll do, but as I said, it's a tough job, and nobody to watch your back." "Meanin'?" "That's how the 2 troubleshooters before you died." The grin was gone from Brown's face, and stern impatience for action had taken its place. "You're pretty much of a mess," he commented. "Reckon you was in that wreck in Solo Canyon." "I was." "That wreck was deliberate according to Callahan. And he says when the masked riders showed up to help drag injured men out of the rubble, that the masked riders' Indian pard found some lengths of fuse and some percussion caps up on the rim. There's a man I'd like to have for a troubleshooter." Brown broke off to add hastily, "No reflection on you, but that hombre is magic with guns and fists. If he comes in on our side, maybe we've a chance to beat that Colorado Central bunch." "Suppose you make things a little clearer," suggested Morgan. "Colorado Central," explained Brown, "is building 70 miles north of us and trying to beat us into Salt Lake, the only decent terminal for a railroad. The government has granted subsidies and land to both lines, but only one road, the first to get there, can have its terminal there and reap the harvest of Mormon trade and traffic. The loser will have to push on into Nevada at a big additional cost. And by that time, government subsidies might run out, which would mean bankruptcy and plenty of loss to thousands of stockholders back east." "You think Colorado Central would use underhanded means to win that race of steel? They might. Bill Tracy, their troubleshooter and superintendent of maintenance, is nothing but a two-bit gunman, capable of anything. But John Winston, a director and the chief engineer, has a good rep. Jim Brown's scowl lent heaviness to his features. The responsibilities of his job were oppressive. That wreck in Solo Canyon will hold up all the material trains from Kansas City, he resumed evenly. We're using 100 cars of supplies a day, and we'll need more than that if we step up our rate to 6 miles of new track each day. That's why I sent 1,000 laborers out to clean up the wreckage and reset the torn-up track. The material trains must be rolling by dawn. Building a railroad shore is a big job, Morgan observed laconically. Bigger than you think, Brown said grimly. It takes thousands of men in sawmills, lumber camps, steel mills to supply the materials, and other thousands to handle the grading, surveying, dynamiting, the building of trestles, and actual laying of steel. We've had trouble and can expect more. Who's behind it, I can't say. It might be Colorado Central, or the gambling bunch that follows the railroad. Or it could be Big Ed Graham's cattleman's combine. Them cowmen lose some of their grays? Is that the reason? Yeah, but that ain't all. Graham has accused our meat hunters of shooting and butchering some of his beef to feed the construction crews. Brown paused, and the grimness about his mouth became accentuated. That could be just an excuse for stirring up trouble among our graders and spikers. Some of them have been acting up because their pay is late this month. Wayne Morgan was thoughtful a moment, cataloging all this information in his keen mind. When he lifted his head, his glance was sharp. Did you ever stop to think that maybe somebody else is butchering Graham's cows and stirring up discontent among your crews just to get the railroad and the ranchers fighting each other? The division superintendent looked surprised, but he had a swift reply. That's something to think about. If you're right, we've got to find out who that is. Morgan was beginning to become impatient. The urge for action was made stronger by the lusty, riotous sounds of Silverbow that filtered through the thin walls of the office. I'm ready to start work, he said abruptly. Any orders? Brown turned to the desk, planted his wide palms on a big surveying map showing the planned route of Wyoming and Western. His voice in giving his orders to Morgan was sharp and harsh. Watch the saloons. Pat Callahan and all the other Patties work hard up in the hills. When they come into town, they're ready to cut loose, and I can't say I blame 'em. I want 'em to have their fun, but I don't want 'em cheated by the gamblers, rolled for their money, or killed in saloon riots. We've had several such riots. Other workers have been found dead in back alleys, their pockets looted. Silverbow is filled with riffraff. Jess Brader, he runs the empire with the help of gunmen like Ned Crescent, has the most say of the saloon owners. I don't trust Brader because he wants a wide-open town and has bucked me before. Your job will be to see that order is kept and that the graders and tie layers and spikers get a square deal in Silverbow. Morgan's shoulders lifted carelessly, and a hard grin replaced the gravity in his face. I've got a free hand? He asked bluntly. Brown nodded. You're the boss. If you have to break any heads or close up a few saloons, go right ahead. I'll back up anything you do. And if you need help, call on Callahan. But watch yourself. The laborers will be your friends. But for every one of them, you'll find a saloon tough ready to bust you, if he can. Even before Brown had stopped talking, Morgan was at the door and had flung it open. Be seeing ya, he said. and started down the rickety stairs into the roaring tumult that was the boomtown of Silverbow. When he reached the bottom of the steps, he paused at the edge of the mass of men which moved like a great tidal wave down the winding length of the main street. In that seething throng were buckskin-clad trappers, bowler-hatted drummers, lanky mule skinners, gamblers in white broadcloth shirts and black frock coats, steel-muscled railroad laborers, and a few painted percentage girls bound for the honky-tonks. The frail, weather-blistered shacks and tents trembled under each savage gust of wind, and flurries of dry snow drifted down out of the overcast sky. A heavily laden freighter, drawn by a double span of grays, rumbled through the ruts. Men dodged out of the way, cursing the yelling mule skinner. 3 wagons were backed up against the loading platform of Gene Edmonton's general store, unloading barrels of flour, beans and molasses, and bolts of dry goods. Every saloon was rocking with the raucous sounds of voices, the harsh clangor of dance bands, the rattle of dice, the shrill yells of barkers drumming up trade. Near the depot, a huge bonfire was blazing. In its light, a half-dozen men toiled with saw and hammer, slapping up the wooden framework of another store or saloon. Nearer, other men tugged at the guy ropes of a tent which threatened to blow away in the gale. Eagerness for action himself gripped Morgan. He hitched up his belt, squared his shoulders, and let himself be carried along with the crowd. There was a bright spark of anticipation in his eyes. He moved in and out of several honky-tonks with their portable bars, then paused in the wide opening of the Empire, the most pretentious saloon in Silverbow. It boasted a 100-foot bar with 15 bartenders sweating and toiling to serve up drinks to the ruddy-cheeked, bellowing railroad men who jostled each other. Morgan stood to one side, watching with interest. All of the gambling games were going. There was poker, faro, chuck-a-luck, roulette, and red dog. Money passed back and forth across the green baize-covered tables. A 7-piece band playing from a raised platform at the far end of the saloon ended a number with a trumpeting flourish. Smiling girls in low-cut gowns and carefully curled hair turned from their whirling progress about the dance floor, slipped hands through the arms of their rugged, bearded partners, leading them to the crowded bar. An aroused murmur of voices at one of the poker tables swung Morgan's attention around. He saw a squat, stocky spiker swallow the last of his drink, rake in a pile of money from the center of the table, then weave an uncertain path toward the door. The slender, pale-cheeked gambler running the game lifted his head slowly. His glance went beyond the spiker to 2 swarthy, gun-hung men lounging near the entrance. The gambler gave them a barely perceptible nod. The 2 men grinned and turned out into the street in the wake of the lurching railroad worker. Wayne Morgan's blood was racing as he pushed his way past 2 graders and sped out of the saloon. He was aware that he was about to undergo his first test as a troubleshooter for Wyoming and Western. Determination was in his features and movement when he lengthened his stride to keep the gunmen in sight. They moved on past 2 intersections, turned down an alley. Wayne Morgan started to run. At this point, the crowd had thinned, but no one paid him any attention. A mirthless grin broke across his lips when he heard the sounds of a scuffle, a cry of pain, a grunted exclamation, then a curse and the thump of blows. Morgan hit the alley and ran down it. In the flickering shadows, he saw that the spiker was down, his 2 attackers bending over him. They whirled at Morgan's approach. One man's head tipped up, his face white against the darkness. His pointed chin was a perfect target for Morgan's knotted fist. The man fell, and his companion dived at Morgan's knees. They went down in a threshing tangle. A knee drove into Morgan's side, and flashes of fiery pain somersaulted through him. The attacker plunged an elbow into Morgan's neck, and a swinging fist set the troubleshooter's head to ringing. Morgan pulled up his legs, planted his boots in the man's middle, and kicked him against the wall of the nearest building. The man struck the timbers with a jolting thud, slid down them. Morgan reared up and feet forward instantly, catching the fellow again with a swinging left. Morgan spun about. Then, hearing the scuff of metal on leather, orange-red streamers of muzzle flame sped past his face as the other gunman, on his feet now, tried to break clear. But the man tripped over the fallen Patty and sprawled headlong. Morgan smashed his booted heel down upon the man's wrist. The gunny howled in pain, and his weapon clattered to the ground. Morgan got a hold on his coat, hauled him to his feet. Instantly the fellow, not yet subdued, butted Morgan in the chest, tried to gouge Morgan's eye. It was wicked fighting, with no holds barred. Morgan kicked the man in the shins, then hit him on the Adam's apple with the edge of his hand, and heard the man draw an agonized breath. The fellow staggered. Morgan stepped in fast, nailed him with a right. He steadied him with a jab, then sent him crashing on his back with a knockout uppercut. Chapter 5. Warning to Jess Brader. Ain Morgan was breathing very hard, and there was blood on his knuckles when he reached the street and peered across the moving throng. He spotted Callahan and yelled to him. The construction foreman hewed a path for himself with his blocky shoulders, with 5 men following him. "You wanted me?" Callahan asked Morgan, grinning. "Yeah, a little job for you." Morgan turned back down the alley. "Bucko, you've started working already?" Callahan exclaimed in surprise when he saw the spiker and the 2 gunmen. He turned over the spiker, who was beginning to stir. "Heck, it's Luke Powers. How did he get here?" These 2 gunmen followed him from the Empire and beefed him. He was carrying heavy poker winnings. Callahan swore, and his big fist clenched. "Jess Brader again. I'd like to get my hands on him." Morgan's chin lifted, and his voice was quiet, deadly. "That's where I'm headed now, Pat. Better have 2 of your boys help Powers over to the work train that'll be heading for the boarding train at end of track at midnight. You and the rest carry these 2 Jaspers to the Empire." Callahan rubbed his hands gleefully, bending down to grab the shoulders of one of the prone gunmen roughly. When Morgan and the railroad workers carrying 2 gunnies came out of the alley and moved toward the center of town, behind them marched a growing wedge of curious Gandhi dancers. Some of Callahan's crew, remembering Morgan from Solo Canyon, called out to him. But he was looking straight ahead, his features rigid because of the pounding urge for action in retribution. Reaching the Empire, they turned into the confusion there. Morgan's swinging shoulders made a path for the 4 men carrying the half-unconscious gunman. Talk dropped off, and the band suddenly stopped playing, leaving couples stranded in the middle of the dance floor. Morgan was grim as he went straight across the saloon toward a door marked Private. He grabbed the knob, gave a savage push on the panel. The door swung open on squealing hinges, and he plunged through. 1 man inside spun about in a swivel chair, and another leaped up from a small table and placed himself solidly against the wall. Morgan turned to Callahan and his 3 Patties. "Drop 'em on the floor," he said curtly. Callahan's challenging glance jumped to the man pressed against the wall. The foreman grinned at Morgan, then let go of the man he held by the shoulders. The paddy holding the gunny's feet relinquished his grip at the same time. Their limp burden hit the floor with an impact that shook the small room. The dropped man groaned and opened bleary, pain-racked eyes. "A present for you," Morgan said to the man at the desk. He waved at Callahan. "Thanks, Pat. That's all." "Heck, I thought we were—" began Callahan. But as Morgan's lips flattened, something in his expression made Callahan wheel and stride out. The 3 railroad workers followed him, slamming the door. The man in the swivel chair, who Morgan judged was Jess Brader, said nothing. He was slender, with an overlong body and eyes that were dark against the pallor of his smooth skin. His glance, cool and inscrutable, never left Morgan. He seemed to be unmoved, but the muscles in his hands, which gripped the armrests of his chair, stood out in ridges. He didn't even bother to glance at his 2 prone gunmen. "The next time you come in here, don't forget to knock," he said. The set line of Morgan's lips hardened. "When and if I have any reason to see you again, Brader, I'll walk right in." Brader stiffened. Something deadly and venomous showed in his eyes. It put a yellowish glitter there. Morgan saw it even while he watched the taut figure of the other man, who he guessed was Ned Cresset, a dour-faced individual with a flattened nose and eyes that were green and sly and shrewd. "Who in blazes are you?" Brader demanded, lifting his voice to a higher pitch in his sudden anger. Turn page. "What do you see?" "What do you say?" "All the same except one. Which is the odd picture?" Answer. "Number 5. He has only 2 holded. The name is Wayne Morgan. That's not important. What is important is that I'm the new troubleshooter for Wyoming and Western." A hot flame danced in his eyes, and he gestured toward the floor. "Better give your 2 hoodlums money to take the next train back east, or tell him to hit the ties. I caught him trying to beat up a construction hand and steal his poker winnings." An indolent smile flicked Jess Brader's lip corners. His hatred for this man was plain, but his expression remained bland, even faintly amused. He spoke to one gunman who was sitting up now, shaking his head to clear the fog from his brain. "That true, Ellers?" "No," came the hoarse reply. "We was walking down the alley and found this Jasper," he pointed at Morgan, "holding a gun on the paddy and going through his pockets. You see?" Brader shrugged. Morgan's temper flared up. He moved toward the sitting gunman, his fist balled in a tight knot. "Maybe your boys need another lesson," he shot at Brader. "Hold off, Morgan," growled Ned Cresset. Morgan whirled, boots planted wide, arms hooked above his tied-down holsters. Cresset had his gun half out of the holster, but couldn't tear his eyes from Morgan's face, for he saw the implacable will and purpose there. Slowly, he let the gun drop back into place. "All right," agreed Morgan softly, and backed a pace to put Brader, Cresset, and the other 2 men into his full line of vision. His personality was a compelling force in this room. These men before him could read how dangerous he was, primed for trouble, eager for it. And even his unspoken challenge to them was uncompromising. For already he had seen enough of this town, of the lusty men who were building the railroad, of the hard cases who frequented the saloons, to know that he had to be tougher than any of them to survive. He must come out on top in this or any trouble that might arise. Once a man backed down in this troubleshooter's job, he realized he was finished. And Morgan never backed down. Many times he had thrown caution to the winds. He had now. Cresset saw that, and the knowledge made him uncertain of what his own actions should be. Get these two gunnies out of Silverbow, Morgan repeated. If I see them again, I'll kill 'em. His words lashed at Brader, bringing a quick flame of color into the gambler's pale cheeks. They work for you. They take your orders. If your orders are to cheat the railroad workers and roll them for their hard-earned pay, you ain't going to be in business long. Bragg shook Brader visibly. He was accustomed to wielding power. His pride, his stubbornness would countenance no interference in his activities. Tough, ain't you? He said, white-lipped. Morgan nodded. And I can get tougher. That's a poor way to stay alive, Brader drawled. You threatening me? No. The smile was back on Brader's lips. A false smile that was humorless. But you might like to know that the last two troubleshooters went out of the boom towns on a board full of lead. Morgan's hard gray eyes and the granite-like cast of his bronzed face bored into the gamblers. Did you supply the boards or the lead? He asked. Neither, Brader said smoothly, but a man can make a heap of enemies in a boom town like this. Don't be a fool. The workers come here to raise cane and spend their money. What's it matter whether they spend it on cards, liquor, or women? It don't, just so's you keep your game straight and give the men a square deal, Morgan said flatly. I understand there's been trouble among the crews, in addition to the wrecking of several supply trains. Brader made a wry grimace. Too bad, but you got to expect such things. I hope you had no hand in 'em, said Morgan. Brader's temper suddenly burst its bonds. He stormed up from his chair and whipped aside the tails of his black coat to reveal an ivory-butted gun at his right hip. Clear out, Morgan, he shouted. I've taken enough from you. Morgan's jaw nodded, and again there was grim challenge in his eyes, and in the words he lashed at Brader. There'll be more if you and the other saloon owners don't toe the line. Remember, if I spot any crooked gambling or see any of your bartenders feeding knockout drops to the paddies, I'll have this place torn down over your head. A brief silence fell upon the room in which the quick, harsh breathing of these men could be heard. An unspoken threat of violence made the stale air suddenly hot and oppressive. It pressed on the saloon man's raw nerves, drove hot words from him. Get out, Morgan, he growled, before I lose my temper. Brader was trembling with fury, dangerous at this moment. But so was Brett. Behind the second man were grouped 4 sober, unsmiling cowhands in regulation range garb. Brown said something that Morgan didn't catch. I heard about that wreck in Solo Canyon, the other man answered. Tough luck. You sure you don't know anything about it, Graham? Brown demanded, thrusting his jutting jaw almost into the other man's face. Nothing would give you more pleasure than to see us busted, I reckon. The man Wayne Morgan realized at once must be Big Ed Graham, the rancher, pushed Brown away from him. Graham was big and blond. His high cheekbones were covered with a fine stubble of light beard, and his eyes were blue and cold. He had a cleft chin, and a rather full underlip gave him a touch of truculence. It was obvious from his manner that he was not a tolerant man. The Masked Rider and Blue Hawk battled to bring peace between nesters and cattlemen in Dead Man's Ranch, complete novel by Larry A. Harris. Next issue, Morgan, who answered him softly. Any time, Brader. You call it. A tawny flash glittered in Brader's eyes. Get out, he repeated hoarsely. Morgan backed to the door, opened it carefully. He paused there, and Brader was aware of the contempt in which this brash troubleshooter held him. How wide is that streak down your back? Morgan demanded, turned and stalked out into the turbulent saloon. The noise of the band and the roar of talk swelled against the frail walls of the Empire. Percentage girls whirled about on the dance floor with their stumbling partners, and the bar was 3 deep with thirsty, clamoring Gandhi dancers. Somewhere a gambler was calling for bets, and a roisterous track layer was challenging any tie cutter or grader in the place to a fight. Morgan caught sight of Jim Brown's broad back at the edge of the crowd and cut over that way. Other pushing men got in his way, but he could see that Brown had cornered a man almost his equal for height, and that he was as firm-willed as Brown. "Watch your tongue, railroad man," he growled. "You make big tracks in Silverbow, but they don't scare me. All the railroad will do for me will be to make it easier to ship cattle to Kansas City markets. But I'll be blasted if I want a railroad at the expense of losing 10,000 acres of free graze that the government handed to Wyoming and Western on a platter. Maybe I could even stand that. But if you think I'm going to let your professional meat hunters go on shooting and butchering my cows, you're in for plenty trouble. I lost 20 more steers last night." Jim Brown's mouth worked savagely. He was oblivious to the men crowding around him, to the threat in the faces of Graham and his sober-eyed punchers. "Railroad guns ain't down in your critters," he declared. "My hunters are roaming far to the north, hitting the antelope bands in the higher hills." "So you say," retorted Graham with an unrelenting frown. "Let me give you this warning. From now on, my punchers will be double-guarding my herds. We'll shoot on sight if anybody tries to run off more steers." Chapter 6. Undercurrents of Trouble. Pat Callahan had gathered a reckless bunch of track layers behind him as soon as he had seen Brown in altercation with Big Ed Graham, and with the ranchers' cold-eyed waddies backing him up. Callahan came storming through the crowded saloon, pushing up behind the division superintendent. His yell pierced the din. "Just say the word, Mr. Brown, and me and the boys 'll give Graham and his hayshakers a going over. That'll make 'em think they was in that wreck in the canyon." Wayne Morgan leaped in front of Callahan, shoved him back, and stood braced in front of him. "Stay out of this, Pat," he advised. He flashed a brief smile, but there was an authoritative ring in his voice. "There's been enough trouble for one night. Take your boys out of here." For an instant, Ed Graham fixed his sharp gaze on Morgan, then swung his attention back to Brown. "Who is that jigger?" he queried, with a curt nod toward Morgan. "Wayne Morgan, our troubleshooter." Brown's heavy hand propelled Morgan around as he made the introduction. "We aim to keep order in town and along the tracks," Brown added. "It's up to Morgan's fists and guns to do it. Keep the railroad's meat hunters off my beef and you'll earn your pay," Graham said coldly, and motioned to the punchers behind him. "Why, you blasted—" Brown made a wild lunge for Graham, but Morgan held him back. "Wait!" shouted Morgan. "Mebbe Graham has been losing beef." "Mebbe he has," growled Brown, "but the railroad has nothing to do with it." His glare held until Graham and his Flying G cowhands had bucked the seething crowd to pile out through the saloon's exit. Smoke hung in the air in thick blue layers. The place was filled with the wreck of whiskey and sawdust and fresh, unseasoned wood. Brown glanced at Wayne Morgan, jerked his head toward the street, and together they moved out into the unending stream of traffic and walked down toward the depot. At the foot of the stairs to Brown's office, the super spun around. His voice boomed over the heads of a dozen spikers. "Hold on, Tracy. And you too, Winston." Wondering what Brown could be up to now, Morgan struck out after him and reached him as Brown drew 2 men aside into the alley opening. "What you doing in Silverbow, Winston?" Brown demanded. Bland gray eyes peering out of a round moon-like face, shoulders broad and stocky, and a manner that was serene. This was John Winston, chief engineer of Colorado Central. He wore a silk hat on his thinning black hair, and the tightness of his frock coat and striped trousers accentuated his slight paunch. "Just checking up on the progress of the opposition," Winston drawled carelessly. He removed a big cigar from his mouth, made a round O of his mouth, and blew out a ring of smoke. "Wild town you've got here. Plenty of men working too, but all a waste of time. You'll never beat Colorado Central into Salt Lake, Brown." "You seem mighty sure of yourself," growled Brown. "Maybe you're making it your business to see that Colorado Central wins, one way or another. You and Bill Tracy here, and maybe some others." "What you mean by that?" cut in the man indicated as Bill Tracy, Colorado Central's troubleshooter. Tracy had a long, pear-shaped face and matted brick-red hair beneath a battered sombrero. There was power in the wide span of his shoulders and arrogance in the thrust of his prominent jaw. He glared hotly at Brown and Morgan. "Brown's talking about the wreck in Solo Canyon," put in Morgan, "and wondering if you fellers know anything about it." "Why, you two-bit boomer," yelled Tracy, and slid a hand toward his gun. Morgan leaped. His arm shot out and came down against Tracy's wrist, spilled Blue Hawk the gun from the man's fingers. A quick thrust of a booted toe sent the weapon skidding into the alley. "Maybe you'd better clear out of Silver Bow before you get hurt," Morgan suggested softly and dangerously. Anger flamed in Bill Tracy's blue eyes, sent hot blood flooding into his cheeks. "You're still a boomer," he rasped, "and there'll be another time." John Winston laughed, plucked at Tracy's arm with a soft, fat hand. "Easy, Bill," he murmured. "They're just on the prod. They've had a dose of hard luck." Jim Brown was scowling. His heavy, penetrating stare pinned the Colorado Central engineer. "There ain't no law says you can't come to Silver Bow," he stated finally. "But here's a warning. My crews are pretty ringy and primed for fight. Better not let 'em spot you here. Maybe your line knows nothing about the wrecks and strikes and riots that have been delaying our construction. But it's all fired queer. I haven't heard of Colorado Central running into that kind of trouble." Winston's bland serenity was not disturbed, but his oily voice seemed to mock Brown when he answered. "We don't need to do anything underhand to beat you, Brown. We're laying down 6 miles of track a day, and we'll soon have it up to 7. Try and beat that if you can. Though if you took my advice, you could save your investors a heap of grief and money by quitting before you find yourself forced to lay steel across the Nevada desert." Winston and Tracy moved off toward the street crowd then, but Tracy swung around once to let the full heat of his glance rest upon Morgan. It warned Morgan that he had made one more enemy, and that the longer he remained here, the greater would become the desire of some to destroy him. That night, Wayne Morgan hired a livery horse and rode out to the camp he and Blue Hawk had established before they had come upon the wreck. He found the Yaqui stolidly waiting for him and wasted no time in revealing his plans for the coming days. All during the lonely journey to the hideout, Morgan had been turning over in his mind the problem of the railroad and its monumental task of winning the race of steel. He had considered the 3 possible agents of opposition to Wyoming and Western, Jess Brader and the Saloon Men, Colorado Central, and Ed Graham's cattle faction. He was definitely suspicious of Brader and of Bill Tracy also, who looked like a cold-blooded killer. He was inclined to trust Ed Graham. The rancher was bluff, hot-tempered, intolerant, and hard-willed, yet he had seemed sincere. Raids could have been made on his cattle. To make certain of the rancher, Morgan outlined his plan to have Blue Hawk brace Graham for a cow-punching job. "It's important to find out how Graham stands, Hawk," urged Morgan. "If you get a job, keep your eyes and ears open and watch for any riders he may send out on mysterious missions. He might be bucking the railroad, and if there are any raids on his beef, let me know. If I see anything, senor, I will find some way of riding into town," promised the Yaqui. "Now I think we'd better move camp west of Silverbow, so it'll be closer to town and also closer to Graham's ranch headquarters," said Morgan. Accordingly, they packed up and led Midnight, Morgan's Hammerhead roan, and Blue Hawk's gray across the rough, rocky country, Morgan riding the livery horse and the Yaqui astride his pinto. It was after 11 when they located a cave at the end of a small, brush-covered coulee, with plenty of graze nearby for the horses. An hour later, Wayne Morgan was back in Silverbow. He was up at dawn, riding out on the first construction train. A small army of assorted track layers, spikers, gaugers, and ballast men crowded a few empty flats as the long train rattled up a grade through the country that grew steadily rougher. Reaching end of track, the workers piled off. A supply train loaded with rails pulled onto the main line from a siding. Black smoke poured from the locomotive stack. Steam jetted from every pounding cylinder. Morgan studied the evenly spaced line of freshly planted ties that marched on over the next ridge into the blue distance, following the seared, scooped-out right-of-way. Pat Callahan was bellowing orders, and men were streaming toward the tool shacks, grabbing up mauls and sledges and tamping bars. Following arrangements made by Jim Brown, Morgan went to a rough rope corral which held a score of saddle horses. He picked out a big chestnut, saddled it, and rode off along the line of ties. After a 12-mile ride, he reached Harlow Creek, where Del Bachelor's bridge and culvert gang was at work, finishing the vast skeleton-like framework of the wooden trestle which spanned the gorge. He dropped out of the saddle to introduce himself to Bachelor. "You'll have to speed up all you can, Bachelor," he warned. "Callahan's bunch is crowding right on your heels with a trek. When they get here, Brown wants them to be able to keep right on going before they catch up with us." "We'll be finished here by tonight," growled Bachelor, "and we'll be moving on to Miller's Canyon, 10 miles beyond the next town site at Beaver Wells." Morgan swung aboard the chestnut and rode on. When he passed through Beaver Wells, he saw that men already were at work sawing and hammering, erecting the first of the flimsy structures which would be waiting for the thirsty army of railroad hands by the time steel reached that point. He covered another 15 miles by mid-afternoon and halted at the big grading camp. Here, private contractors with teams of powerful horses and mules dragged great steel scoops through freshly scarred earth, chopping at brush-covered hillsides and flattening out a broad right-of-way for the tie setters moving up fast behind them. Morgan stressed the need for speed and more speed, then announced that another 100 men would be out in the morning to push the grading operations. He was tired from the long ride, from the steady lash of the bitter winter wind which had been cutting into his face during the entire journey. But he was anxious to return to Silverbow, so he switched his saddle to another horse and started back. Chapter 7. End of track. Long after nightfall, Wayne Morgan reached Del Bachelor's bridge camp. He found a place to sleep in one of the tents, but was up again at dawn and riding on. It was another raw, cold day, with the sky filled with dark, fleecy clouds and the threat of snow in the damp, roughening wind. At 8 o'clock, the squat, tin-roofed tool shacks and warehouses that lined end of track took shape before him. A material train stood idle on the rails. No smoke came from the stack, and there was no harsh clang of steel on steel, no bellowing voices of men, none of the confusion and tumult of construction. Then he saw the reason. The track layers and spikers were milling around, listening to the shouted words of some speaker who kept waving his arms for emphasis. Trouble, thought Wayne Morgan. He felt his muscles tighten, then go loose with the readiness for action. Clods of dry earth spurted from beneath his pony's hoofs as he kicked the animal into a run. Brawny, grim-eyed workers swung around at his approach. As Morgan pulled in his horse, he caught several sentences of the speaker's tirade. "Don't be fools, men. Your pay is already a week late. Why go on laying track if you don't know if you'll ever get the dinero you've sweated for? Back in KC, there's rumors that Wyoming and Western is about busted. The investors are acting up. Where'll you be then? To blazes with Callahan or Jim Brown? Lay down your tools." That was more than enough for Morgan. He was off his horse before the mount had stopped, planting his boots wide to skid to a halt. He saw the speaker looking over the heads of the crowd, mockery twisting his lips. The orator was Bill Tracy. Cold anger shot through Morgan. His rigid lips were a pale line against the thundercloud of his face. Tracy seemed to be eagerly waiting for him, with two gun-hung toughs at his elbow. But Morgan's rage was greater than his caution. Furiously, he shoved big, bulky spikers and track layers aside until he reached Tracy, where he stopped, breathing hard. "Looks like Colorado Central is dabbing a wide loop," he snapped, a metallic ring in his voice. "You had my warning in town, Tracy. Now you've gone too far." Tracy sneered. In his eyes, the glint of mockery was accentuated. "What I said goes," he drawled. "You're still a two-bit boomer." Wayne Morgan knew then that the time for action had come. This was showdown, with a silent Wyoming and Western crew at his back, waiting to see what he would do. Morgan never hesitated, and once again, the speed of his movements took Tracy by surprise. He threw himself at the man to Tracy's left, drove a shoulder into the fellow's chest, and knocked him into the other man. Both men crashed to earth, upsetting a few patties as they fell. Morgan came directly at Tracy without a breath of delay. A looping left found Tracy's jawbone. It lifted him 2 inches off the ground, dropped him flat on his back. Cursing, Tracy rolled and made a lightning stab for his gun. It flashed upward. There was the flat bark of a weapon, but no smoke curled from Tracy's Colt. The shot came from a long-barreled .45 in Morgan's muscular hand. That bullet clanged off Tracy's gun, sent it spinning away. There was a shout behind Morgan. He whirled. One of Tracy's partners rushed him, a gun clubbed in his fist. Morgan sidestepped. He took a glancing blow on the shoulder and struck savagely with his gun. The barrel cracked down on the man's forehead. The sharp sight raked down his nose, gouging a bloody furrow to his lower lip. The man groaned and collapsed, but Tracy was getting up, trying to come in at Morgan from the left. Morgan heaved himself on the other troubleshooter, bore him back to the ground. A knee slammed into Morgan's stomach. A fist pounded the back of his neck. Then he smashed Tracy's nose with a hard left. A swinging arm knocked Morgan's gun out of his hand, but he split Tracy's lip, drove 2 teeth down the man's throat with another savage blow. Then he grabbed him by the ears, belted his head against the ground. He was doing that when a booted toe struck his ribs. A gusty breath spilled from his lungs. Hot slivers of pain skidded up and down his side as he saw the dark flash of 2 boots above him, coming down to crush his chest. He kept on rolling. One of those boots hit him glancingly. Then his big hands trapped an ankle and pulled his third attacker joltingly to the ground. Morgan's ribs still felt as if they were on fire, and all his muscles were beginning to ache. The man he had felled had had the wind knocked out of him. But he was fighting to get his knees under him, trying to swing around to meet Morgan. Morgan, all thoughts of mercy gone now, climbed to his feet and rushed the man. He got a hold on his attacker's belt and the seat of his pants and hefted him above his head. It took a tremendous, straining effort, but he whirled the fellow above him, then tossed him down on top of the huddled forms of Tracy and the other gunman. Panting, he stood over the 3, his head drooping, his shirt ripped and hanging out over his pants. There was a bruise on his right cheek. 2 of the knuckles on his right hand were skinned. He sucked in great gulps of air, conscious all the while that the patties had made no sound or movement. Then one of them yelled. That broke the tension. Everyone started to talk and shout at once. Morgan lifted his head. They had been discontented when he had arrived and willing to listen to Tracy's tirade. But now their belligerence was gone, and the way they were grinning was a deep satisfaction to Wayne Morgan. A broad-chested spiker with heavy arms and a fight-scarred face came up. Admiration brightened his bloodshot eyes. "Good glory, Morgan," he whispered. 3 men. "You almost killed him," called another. Morgan made no reply. He still was under a strain, even though he was aware that he had won these men over to his side. They were a rough bunch who loved to fight, and he had handled this in the one way they could understand. Tracy was stirring on the ground. Moans issued from his throat. His nose was lost in the blood that covered his face. He glared at Morgan, but he was too weak to talk. "Some of you huskies, load these 3 men on one of them empty flat cars," Morgan directed. He added bitterly, "And if any of you feel like quitting, get out right now. Take that empty supply train back to Silverbow or hit the ties. It's work or quit. As for your pay, Jim Brown told me yesterday it's due in tonight." "Come on, men," yelled the broad-chested spiker. "We've lost 2 hours. We've got steel to lay." That decided the crew. They made a wild rush toward the tool shacks. Only a handful of men who had the appearance of border riffraff remained hostile. These tramped off and jumped on the waiting empty train. From the big spiker, Morgan learned that Callahan had been held in town for a conference with Brown. Evidently, it hadn't taken Tracy long to find out Callahan would be away, and to capitalize on that by trying to stir up trouble. Morgan wondered if Tracy had been acting on Winston's orders. Within 15 minutes, End of Track was its usual bedlam of sound and activity. A long material train chuffed up along the rails. 6 bulky, high-wheeled freight wagons began loading supplies. They would rumble on along the right-of-way, some bound for the distant grading camps, others going straight to the Mormon towns. Bell clanging, couplings jolting noisily, the empty material train steamed off. In the distance, a dark column of smoke lifted to the sky, and the eerie banshee wail of a locomotive whistle announced the approach of another supply train. Piles of steel and ties lined the tracks, and now a material train pushed up to the very end of track. Laborers swarmed on top of the flat cars, began loading rails on a big flatbed wagon pulled by a team of strong bays. The driver flicked his whip, and the wagon trundled off, halting a short distance beyond the puffing locomotive. Other men rushed up to the lower tailboard of the wagon. 4 laborers took hold of each rail. 8 men made a team. They dropped the rails on the ties. The gaugers knelt and quickly lined up the new rails. Then, the spikers came forward, swinging their heavy sledges. After them followed the bolters and the ballast men. All were moving with furious speed, and the activity got into Morgan's blood, put a light in his eyes. The rail gang was dumping 2 more lengths into place when Morgan came up. "I saw John Winston of Colorado Central in town the other night," he told the men. "He was bragging that Wyoming and Western would never beat him into Salt Lake. He said they was laying 6 miles of track a day." Morgan's voice beat at these men vibrantly. "I say we can make it 8. How about it, men?" A roar of approval was his answer that poured yellow light out across the street's brown dust. Morgan was on his way to the office when a young surveyor told him that Jim Brown wanted to see him in a hurry. Morgan had good news for the division's superintendent and was anxious to report the success of his mission to the grading and track camps. But with this urgent summons from Brown, he felt an uneasiness for a reason he could not define, submerge his satisfaction over his report. It was a vague suspicion that something was wrong, but what, he could not guess. Rapping on the flimsy wooden panels of Brown's office door, Morgan entered at the super's gruff command. Instantly, the barrel of a gun was rammed into his back, and he found himself facing a strangely hostile Brown. "Come in, Morgan," snapped Brown. "You're just the Jasper we want to see." "What's the idea?" Morgan demanded. Coming next issue, Judge Colt's Clerk, an exciting short story by Oscar J. Friend, plus many other quick trigger stories and features. And Morgan pitched in to work himself. He grabbed up a maul and drove a heavy blow upon the head of an iron spike. They laid 8 miles of track by quitting time that night. Morgan, working like a beaver, made that possible. He was glad he had spent several months in railroad construction work once before, when the masked rider had been gathering evidence against a lawless combine. No man worked harder during those long hours than did Wayne Morgan. But when darkness came, he knew he had Callahan's Paddies solidly behind him and that he'd help set the pace for new and greater construction records to come, even though unaccustomed muscles protested at the grueling toil. It was a tired, exhausted bunch of men who dropped off the construction train in Silverbow that night. But they were gay and boisterous too, with a thirst in their throats and cheerful grins on their dirt-grimed faces. Their first stop was the railroad pay car on the siding. From there they rushed toward restaurants and saloons angrily, as his guns were lifted from their holsters. A middle-aged man with graying hair and a strong face marked by prominent cheekbones over which the skin was stretched as taut as a drum, stepped around Morgan. There was a gun in his fist, and he threw Morgan's Colts to the floor. The man was dressed well, but the dust and soot of recent travel was on his well-tailored clothes. "There's the idea, lying on that bench over there," this man said. And there was a brittle, paper-thin quality about his speech. His eyes were hard and unfriendly. "Ever see that man before?" Morgan glanced to the bench under the window. He was accustomed to shock, but could not repress a start when he saw the bloody, dusty, lifeless figure sprawled there. "Jack Banyan!" Morgan exclaimed, and in a flash he could realize his own compromising position. He looked up at Brown. Taciturn and grim, Brown nodded toward the gray-haired man. "He's Colonel Darwin, Chief Engineer of the Road," said Brown. Chapter 8. Morgan is exposed. Arwen faced Morgan squarely, and his brown eyes probed deeply into the blue ones of the troubleshooter. I'm the man who gave Jack Banyan a letter addressed to Jim Brown, Darwin said, a tremor of rage in his voice. But the man who arrived with that letter answers to the name of Wayne Morgan. Abruptly, Darwin lost all semblance of calm. Just who are you? He rasped. What's your game in Silverbow? Who sent you here? Ed Graham, Jess Brader, or that blasted Colorado Central crowd? Talk fast. If you've got a story, it better be good. With an effort, Wayne Morgan kept his temper. These men had a right to be angry, to be upset by the finding of Banyan's body. If you've got an explanation, let's hear it, snapped Brown. Some paddies cleaning up the last of the mess in Solo Canyon found Banyan half covered with rocks in a culvert. You've got a right to be suspicious of me, admitted Morgan, wondering how he could have neglected to have a logical story ready for such an emergency as this. I'd hooked a ride behind the tender of that supply train when it stopped for water back in Hondo. I was hoping to pick up a job with the railroad. When the landslide started, I was thrown into the culvert. I came to and found Banyan beside me, half dead and covered with dirt and rubble. He'd been smashed up by a section of steel boiler from the locomotive. He was babbling about a Jim Brown and a note in his pocket. I found the note. Since I was at a loose end, I figured I'd try to land Banyan's job. That's why I substituted the names in the letter. Darwin's expression was cold and contemptuous. You're a two-faced liar, he stated bluntly. If anybody was to ask me, he went on, I'd say you're a spy hired to delay Wyoming and Western. You're probably one of the mob that dynamited the canyon. Somebody got wind of Banyan coming to Silverbow, and you were on hand to take his place after the wreck. Jim Brown looked troubled. He cleared his throat and lifted a protesting hand at the chief engineer. Wait, Colonel, he said. I'll admit, Morgan was wrong in taking Banyan's letter, but he's sure done one good job for the road already. He put a wedge in Jess Brader's power, down in two of his hoodlums in a fight after they'd beefed Luke Powers. Stay out of this, Jim, ordered Darwin. I'm remembering, too, that you were telling me about the masked rider showing up right after the wreck. The masked rider is an outlaw, and for all we know, this fellow is a close friend of his. Morgan was smiling, amused. Yeah, he was a pretty close part of the masked riders, all right. Would that masked man have helped clear up the mess and pull out the injured, or would he have sent his Indian partner to find definite proof that the wreck was caused by dynamite if he was crooked? Demanded Brown. His idea might have been to make you think he was on the level. Brown shook his head stubbornly. Nope. From all the stories I've heard about the masked rider, I believe he's a square shooter who helps folks in trouble. Forget it, snapped Darwin, a most unpleasant expression on his thin, ascetic face. He looked at Morgan and added, You were mighty careful about covering up Banyan's body so it wouldn't be found. I know, said Morgan. I realize now I should have applied openly for the job and told Brown about finding Banyan. But you didn't. I've had enough crookedness and intrigue on this railroad. We've bucked it for months. It's going to stop if I have to spend all my time in this blasted town to clean up the mess myself. My first step is to find out who's behind the trouble. You going to talk, Morgan? Morgan had been studying Colonel Darwin. Now he fully realized that nothing he could say would convince this man he had taken the step he had in good faith. Nevertheless, he made another attempt. I've told the truth, he insisted. Nobody hired me for anything, and I had no part in that wreck. Was it Bill Tracy or Jess Brader? Demanded Darwin. Perhaps your move against Brader was another part of a clever trick. First time I ever heard of Brader and Cresset both being bluffed at the same time by one man. There's always a first time, Morgan told him bluntly. It just takes a little sand. You sure you don't mean it takes working on the same deal with friends? Darwin was implacable in his accusation. Again he barked, "What's your game?" "There is no game." "All right." Darwin's face set. Watching him, Morgan knew that the chief engineer had reached some grim decision. "Maybe after I hand you over to the construction workers and tell them you're an imposter, you'll feel more like talking. Only it'll be too late then. The Paddies have their own way of handling traitors." Jim Brown's head came up, his eyes widening. He stared at Darwin as if he couldn't believe the engineer meant what he was saying. But Darwin's lips were drawn, his manner uncompromising. His hand whitened around the gun he held. Its barrel came level with Morgan's chest. The flickering lamplight seemed to accent the threat of peril that tingled Morgan's nerves, a threat that was real and disturbing. "Turn around and head for the door, Morgan." Darwin gestured imperiously with his gun. "You're on your way out, on the end of a rope." The same morning that Wayne Morgan rode out to the Wyoming and Western grading camps, Blue Hawk put in an appearance at Ed Graham's Flying G Ranch. It was a rough mountain spread with plenty of good graze in the lower meadows. The rambling log buildings were well kept, and a fine bunch of broncs capered around in a stout corral 100 yards from the bunkhouse. Before he reached the low-railinged veranda, 3 or 4 punchers strolled out of the barn and came up to the house, watching him carefully. Blue Hawk studied them with inscrutable eyes. They were proddy and suspicious of all strangers. A big man with a heavy shock of blonde hair on his massive head flung open the front door of the ranch house and strode to the veranda steps. Ed Graham, the Yaqui knew from Wayne Morgan's description of the rancher. "Looking for something?" he asked curtly. "A job," said Blue Hawk. A bald, bow-legged man with yellowed teeth shifted a cud of chewing tobacco in his mouth and spat beneath the Yaqui's horse. "We need cowhands," he observed, "but we don't want Injuns." Blue Hawk stared at the bow-legged man until the man dropped his gaze. "Don't butt in, Harker," ordered Graham. The rancher was a shrewd judge of men. He had already been impressed by the Yaqui's dignity, and now by the way in which he stared down Harker, as well as by his stolid indifference to the hostility of the other punchers. "We can use another hand," he said, "but it'll be at fightin' pay. That change your mind any about wantin' a job?" "No," Graham's voice turned harsh. "We're bucking the railroad," he growled, "and I've got reason to believe their hunters have been stealing and butchering my beef. I aim to stop it if I have to wage a wholesale war against the Steel Gang. Heck of a lot of fighting this Injun will do with only a knife in his belt." The bow-legged man sneered. "Can you handle a 6-gun redskin?" Blue Hawk didn't smile, and he didn't lift his voice to reply. "I don't like 6-guns, he said. "I prefer the knife and my rifle. In a fast fight at close quarters, you'd be no good to us with a rifle." Abruptly, Blue Hawk's pose of stolid patience left him. He bent low in the saddle toward the upthrust butt of the Winchester reposing in the specially rigged scabbard. The Flying G punchers caught just a brief blur of the rifle spearing upward. Then there was a flash of flame, a mushroom of smoke, and the bow-legged cowhand's sombrero sailed off his head. One of the other punchers retrieved it, staring wide-eyed at the bullet puncture in the battered crown. The bow-legged man's face turned the color of ashes. Then anger flamed, and with a loud yell, he clawed for his 6-gun. "Hold everything, Harker," snapped Ed Graham. He saw the mingled amazement and anger on Harker's face, and suddenly peals of laughter boomed from the depths of his chest. "Why, that blasted engine might have killed me," howled Harker. "I reckon not," said Graham. "That was rifle shooting, if I ever saw it. Any Jasper that can handle a Winchester like this Indian does don't need a six-gun. Pull in your horns, Harker. You sure asked for that play." The faintest shadow of a smile lifted the corners of Blue Hawk's mouth. He had figured the right play here, all right. "Climb down and make yourself at home," invited Graham. "You've earned a job at the Flying G." Graham made him acquainted with the rest of the crew. Harker continued to act resentful because a severe blow had been dealt to his pride, but the others accepted the Yaqui calmly enough. In fact, they treated him with a marked respect. The next morning, the entire crew turned out of their bunks before dawn. A big cavy of horses was driven off into the hills, followed by a well-stocked hoodloomin' chuck wagon. With winter coming on rapidly and the imminence of heavy snowstorms, Ed Graham did not want to run the risk of having any of his beef trapped in the higher mountain passes. He put 20 men to combing the breaks and canyons of his Lurie Hills range. It was rough, tiring work with a bitter wind whipping against the punchers' faces, turning their cheeks raw and red. Blue Hawk rode with that crew, and he took the steepest slopes, the most treacherous ravines on his trained cowpony. Wild-eyed steers were choused out of their hiding places, sent careening down to a temporary holding ground. A brief pause was made at noon for some hot chuck and coffee liberally laced with whiskey. Then, switching saddles to fresh horses, the crew rode out again. For 2 days they canvassed the Lurie Hills. By mid-afternoon of the second day, they had rounded up 200 head and pushed them down into one of the lower meadows, protected on 3 sides from wind and snow by a ring of rolling ridges. Graham detailed 3 men to ride gun guard on that beef and prepared to move his base camp into the yellow ridges after more strays. Blue Hawk and 3 other punchers were sent back to headquarters to see that everything was all right there, and to bring out some spare horses. Several mounts had been lamed during the difficult hazing operations.